Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear speakers. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to the first panel debate of the series related to the House of European History's temporary exhibition, Fake for Real. This temporary exhibition shows us that fake news is not restricted to any specific era. Fakes, forgeries, falsifications, and conspiracy theories have been used for centuries, taking advantage of the capacity of the human brain to be deceived. What is special about the current situation we live in is that modern means of communication allow for the rapid spread and dissemination of false information on a global scale. Truth, as an ideal that seems to become ever more important, is often used as a headline to mask yet another false story. The past year with the pandemic and the subsequent disinfodemic has shown us that disinformation travels rapidly across borders. The same false narratives about the pandemic circulated in different countries at the same time. Experts have therefore requested more cross-border cooperation to counter this disinformation. Having recognized the topic as a pan-European challenge, the European Union has launched several initiatives to prevent and oppose disinformation. The European Parliament has started reflecting on new legislation in the area, and a new committee is studying issues of foreign interference. However, the challenge is not only a political one. Each and every media user can check the trustworthiness of the source and content of an article or post before sharing it with others. As all the stories of debunking fakes and forgeries in our exhibition show, the critical mind that questions first impressions, emotional reactions, and one's own prejudices is what can help us separate fact from fiction, fake from real. But is our human brain fit for this purpose? The preparation of this talk made me revisit Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. Cognitive biases, the anchoring effect, framing, the optimistic bias. His research suggests that people tend to have too much confidence in human judgment. We will come back to these questions at one of the upcoming events of the series, in which a professor of clinical neuropsychology will show us how easy it is to hack and manipulate our brains. But for today, I will finish with a slightly provocative quote from Kahneman. Do not trust anyone, including yourself, to tell you how much you should trust their judgment. Tonight, we are surrounded by experts who have made the quest for truth and trust their daily mission. I'm thrilled to be hosting such renowned experts in fact-checking and social media. I hope that you can indicate the best paths for us to follow. Thank you all very much for being here. And now, here to introduce the speakers to you and to moderate the discussion is Paul Salmons. Paul is an independent curator who describes it as his mission to help people to make meaning of difficult histories and to make the past more present. A mission that is quite similar to the House of European History, which is trying to make sense of the history of a continent for today's audiences. Paul, the fake floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. And I would like to begin firstly by inviting our audience, thanking our audience, everyone there for giving your time to be with us, but also given that this series is called Between Truth and Trust, and today's focus is on disinformation, I'd like to ask you to think, why would you believe anything anyone involved in today's event has to say? How do you know what is true? Who do you trust? Why do people spread so-called fake news? And what can we do to detect and counter the spread of disinformation? I'm delighted that we are joined by an esteemed panel: Carl Miller from the think tank Demos, BBC journalist Mariana Spring, CEO of Maldita, data journalist Clara Jimenez Cruz, each of whom I will introduce more fully as I invite them to speak. But I have to admit, I don't know any of them personally. We've met a couple of times online to discuss how we'll proceed in this event, but none of us could be called upon to provide a character reference for the other. So why should you listen to them on the compelling questions we'll address today? A simple, but I believe compelling answer is that we do not draw upon them as random individuals, of course, but because we prize their deep knowledge, their expertise and experience, because of their reputations, the esteem of their peers, and because their training in disciplines of knowledge, the ethics of their professions, and the integrity of the organizations that they represent. None of this means, of course, that we have to agree with everything our panelists have to say. I very much look forward to the questions that will come from you, our audience, and how that will contribute to and deepen our conversations. But I am confident that we will all benefit from our panelists' insights, and that this will deepen our thinking and our understanding of the phenomenon of disinformation, and give us new understandings of how we might counter it. So I'd like to begin by introducing our first speaker today. Carl Miller is an author, speaker, and researcher at Demos, a think tank in London, where he co-founded the Centre for the Analysis of Social Media. He's also a visiting scholar and research fellow at King's College London, and his book, The Death of the Gods, the New Global Power Grab, analyzes power in the digital age. In the context of the European House of History's new exhibition, Fake For Real, which documents the long history of fakes, forgeries, and disinformation, I'd like Carl to open our conversation today by telling us what is new about the era we find ourselves in. How has the internet and other digital technologies transformed the ways in which we consume information about the world and our relationship to truth? Carl, delighted to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Paul, and hi there, everyone. Now, I'm going to start by saying that I am a historian by training, so I feel very keenly both the power of history to help us shape and understand the world we live in today, and also the kind of endless continuum of history up to the present. But I will make an argument over the next 10 minutes that there is something new happening. I will, and I hope I carry at least some of you with me. I'm going to begin with this, where we find ourselves, where we stand in the middle of this kind of swirling bundle of words and ideas. We've got fake news, we've got misinformation, we've got disinformation, we've got covert inauthentic behavior, we've got platform manipulation, we've got conversational unhealth. There's all these words that surround us, which we see happening, jumping into our streams and into our news feeds more and more. But there is an underlying idea, which I think kind of really explains all of those different words and all of those different concepts. And to understand that, I want to take everyone back about 10 years to the beginning, a bit more, to the beginning of the kind of mid-noughties. And it's then when militaries around the world were all asking themselves a single and important question. The question was, we're now going into the information age. How do we as militaries have to change what we do in order to stay relevant? How do we as militaries need to keep up? Those are the questions that they were all asking themselves at that point. Now, they all recognized, as we all do, of course, that information had long been a tool of war. You know, people had always lied in war. People had always tried to manipulate the enemy's perception of the battlefield or perception of themselves. Morale was also really important in war as well. But their answer to that question back then in 2005 and 2006, I think, changed everything. And I think it was a completely new reformulation of the role of information and war, because they all performed, and it was like a stack of dominoes. And it began first in the US military, then it was the UK military, then it was liberal democracy militaries everywhere, and also the autocracies. Everyone basically came to the same answer. They performed this enormously consequential, conceptual pirouette. Rather than seeing information as a tool of war, they began to see it as a theatre of war. They began to see it as a space that warfare happens within. So now you had air, sea, land, space, cyber, and information. And it was an information that militaries had to maneuver, had to dominate, had to compete within, just as much as they would in the space, or just as much as they would in the air or on the ground. So you began to see this entirely new kind of militarized vocabulary begin to emerge as militaries began to think through the problem of how to dominate information. You did have information maneuver, you had the information battle space, you had mimetic weaponry. All of this began to emerge. And really, in the kind of years since then, that same idea has left militaries and has begun to be taken up by almost everyone. Like, it's taken up by political campaigns, it's taken up by disaffected individuals, it's taken up by small groups of political extremists trying to change the world. The same idea that information warfare is the main way in which we can, reach through our computers and seek to have power and seek to reshape the world. That idea is coming up again and again and again and again. And now you cannot look at any election, at any geopolitical confrontation, at any massive dispute or global conversation around the world without seeing both the idea of information warfare as being quite central to the way in which parties and counterparties are conducting that struggle, and also the grab bag of different tactics, which has grown up in consequence of that pivot in how to fight information warfare. And I'll turn to that next. So it wasn't just the idea, it wasn't just new, this idea that information was a space of war. What was also new then was the ways in which warfare would be fought, the way in which struggle would happen. Of which, of course, disinformation and fakes are a part. And the construction of false or front news organizations and the propagation of fake news stories was a part. But there were much subtler forms of forgery which were being developed as part of this tradecraft as well. You had platform manipulation. So this wasn't the idea that you would fake the overt content, but you would fake how the platform works in order to make one truth more visible than another truth. You could fake the way in which things trended. You could fake the ways in which algorithms served up information to you, or what an algorithm or platform even thought was useful or interesting to you in the first place. You could also forge social reputation systems, Amazon reviews, ratings. You can make things appear much more popular than they really were. You can make things appear much more successful than they really were. You had search engine manipulation. You could manipulate the web pages that people visited. You could begin to basically twist and control the vast flows of eyeballs around the world. You could control what millions of people saw when they were trying to learn about a particular topic, when they were trying to form a point of view. And again, only lying at the overt level of the content is only part of now what is a very deep and increasingly sophisticated way in which that happens. You can build an extremely distorted picture of the world to people simply by making some truths more visible than other truths. Lastly then, the consequences of all of this are really profound. So once you start to see information as a space in which warfare happens, and you start to see and use this whole kind of grab bag of tactics in order to fight it, suddenly the role that we all have changes really quite significantly. Suddenly, all of our psychologies, and I love the fact that Kahneman was quoted at the beginning, because Kahneman and cognitive biases are very central to so much of this. Our psychologies become a form of strategy. Suddenly you have all these techniques which are really interested in dopamine studies, really interested in behavioral psychology, really interested in cognitive biases, really interested in making us feel things as much as think things. For sure, this is not necessarily just about rational actors. This has so much less to do with feeding you a lie and getting you to kind of like critically appraise it. That is important, but it's also got to do with making you even more convinced about an injustice you already see existent in the world, and then massaging your anger and your outrage in a particular direction. That's a far easier way of manipulating someone than trying to change their worldview through a lie. So psychology becomes a strategy. Attention becomes a form of territory, and you deploy a Stratcom news agency funded by your autocratic military as you would capture a hill. You know, this is the new place in which territory is fought and lost. And our eyeballs are those tiny minutiae where the fronts move back and forth across the new geopolitical fault lines where truth and trust and belief work. And then lastly, and I'll end on this because this is perhaps the most constant and the least new thing of all. I think it is, to me it's the most terrifying of them all, which is that content, as it's so called, kind of loses any inherent value it would have to either be truthful or not truthful. And frankly, for the people that do this, and I try and interview them, whether something is true or not is really quite irrelevant, because the reason you would deploy a piece of content is simply as an instrument for ulterior effects. It's to change beliefs and it's to change behavior. That is what warfare has always been about. That is whether you use violence or use information operations or something else, you're changing the outcome of basically a behavioral change of some kind. You're either getting people to do stuff that they weren't going to do, or you're stopping them do something they were going to do. And now you deploy content purely for that purpose. So whether an argument is true, whether it adds to the human understanding of the world, whether it makes our commons a richer place, whether it makes us more powerful or informed as citizens, in this idea is the real, in the idea of information warfare, is the real casualty. Because whether it does or doesn't matter in the eyes of the people fighting this. What does matter is whether feeding you a piece of information fits within the theory of change, fits within their idea of how you're going to be influenced, and fits within their idea and their strategy, really, of what they want you to do next. And I think that pivot then, to go back to the start, that pivot of changing information from being a tool to being a space, I genuinely think that's new. And I think we're only in the foothills of really understanding and realizing how significant and consequential that shift is, and how much that is going to shape the future world that we live in.
Thank you, Carl. That's a great opening. And I'd just like to, before we move to our colleague Guido Gerrichhauzen, who will share with us some insights from the exhibition as well, just to press you a little, if I may, on a couple of things that you say. Are you able to give us one or two concrete examples of the kinds of things that you're talking about there? Because in your limited time, I know you've given us a very clear theoretical overview. Could you give us a couple of examples that we can kind of hang some of that on so we can see it in practice also?
Sure, and Mariana, I hope. I mean, she's a million times more informed and better than me on all of that. So I'll give you one very brief one and then cede the floor. But back in 2019 was another watershed moment. It was the first time that Facebook took down a network which we know was dedicated to trying to influence the UK. They didn't quite say who was behind it, but if you want my money, it's on the Russians. When they actually, but we know it was what they would call a coordinated and inauthentic network. So it's a series of pages and groups that apparently have nothing to do with each other. And if you actually looked at the content, it was squatting on both ends of the political spectrum. So you had racists and xenophobes and anti-Semites. And then you had another group of people, not extremists, I don't mean to imply that, but another group of people that were extremely, extremely angry at the racists and the xenophobes and the anti-Semites. And they were all being controlled by a single coordinated group. And that kind of, I think in a way, like kind of is underlying the point I'm trying to make, which was that there was a kind of, this was a deployment, very likely geopolitically, conducted by one country against the watching populace of another, and these were all UK groups. And there was a kind of implied underlying strategy behind this, which we think is likely to be that they were trying to infiltrate into already existing communities online both on the far right and in the world of anti-racist activism, and make both groups angrier at each other than they were previously. Often simply by drip feeding information about what the other group was doing over the line into the groups that they were building. So it's very weird. I mean, this is a strange new form of geopolitics. This is a strange new opportunity that states see to exist in order to kind of undermine the coherence and the ability to act, I think, politically of adversary states. It's conducted often centrally and done to quite a specific strategy and theory of change as to what they want to have happen as a result of the investment, I suppose you can see they're making.
Thank you. That's great. So we'll come back to many of these issues, I'm sure, and also invite questions from our audience. But we are hosted, of course, today and in this series by the House of European History, part of the European Parliament. And I'd like to invite Guido Gerrichhauzen, who is a highly skilled educator who has worked at the National Liberation Museum in the past and also the Anne Frank House in Amsterdam, where I first met Guido. And now he works for the House of European History, and he was the lead educator on the Fake For Real exhibition, which provides our context for this series of discussions and online debates. So I'd like to ask Guido, please, to share with us a glimpse into that exhibition. It's such a shame we can't be there and visit, but to at least give us a glimpse of the exhibition and how you, through your educational work, also try to approach some of the questions that we're exploring in our conversations today. Guido.
Thank you, Paul, and welcome to everybody, or hello to everybody watching from home. I will start sharing my screen to give you indeed a small insight in our temporary exhibition. So I hope you can see the PowerPoint presentation. It's just a few slides to give you an insight in the temporary exhibition, as many of you are unable to visit the museum. So I will take you to a few parts of the temporary exhibition. Unfortunately, I cannot show everything, of course, as I just have a few minutes to show you some elements. So today I will mainly focus on the topic of disinformation and what kind of connections we make there. And of course, we immediately see on this slide actually the archetype of the Trojan horse. And we think maybe that the current quantity of disinformation, that it seems unmatched, but the topic is an ancient one. History is filled with countless examples of fake pretending to be real. For instance, as I said, here the Trojan horse that we can see here, a typical mythological archetype of deception, symbolically links ancient time to our very contemporary problems of the internet-dominated world. So it connects the past to the present, which is something we do throughout the temporary exhibition. It also touches upon the fact if disinformation is something new and what in our current world today might be different, something Paul already addressed. But before visitors actually enter the temporary exhibition, you will see a fake box of glass. And on the fake box, different elements related to the temporary exhibition, including the Trojan horse, are displayed on this fake box. In this routine of daily life, the sensational and supernatural are sweet seduction. They allow us to escape the ordinary, but the game of deception is of course only fun when we agree to it. When we are deliberately deceived, we are on the losing side in many regards. Visitors first can initially make some associations what fake actually means to them. So they are invited to make a connection to them. What is fake actually? And after they have seen this fake box, they step into a labyrinth full of fakes, falsifications, and forgeries from ancient time to our present-day society. You will explore what might be have changed over time, or be surprised to see some recurring questions that were actually applicable ages ago already. Also, when we actually connect the past to the present, we also go in during time. So the connection that I highlight today, or one of the examples that I highlight, is actually in the printing era, when pamphlets were distributed. So this is around 1440. The invention of the printing press led to a new era with information becoming available on a massive scale. But an ever-increasing quantity of information does not guarantee accuracy, as we know. And also back then, it led of a deluge of information, and therefore also back then to disinformation and misinformation. Those who actually spread a lot of pamphlets were happy because they could, of course, spread false rumors or false information. But the printed revolution also had many victims, maybe also likewise as today. A lack of control over content created unease, likewise to today's concerns about fake news, distorted realities, and hate speech. What we can see here in the pictures is what we invite visitors to do, is to have a look at these pamphlets and to see what they would do. Would they censor some of these pamphlets, or would they publish them? They will also see the result, how other voters, what they have voted for about this, and they will actually see what happened in the past. Was it published or was it censored? And also they, in this way, discover what kind of impact it has also back then. As I already told you at the start of my presentation, I cannot go through the entire exhibition, unfortunately. So we make a big jump to our time nowadays, also called the post-truth era. And here we invite visitors to explore this time via different games that we have developed for this temporary exhibition. As the red line of the exhibition shows that this information is not restricted to any specific era, the current situation is special, as of course modern means of communication, notably social media, allow for its rapid spread and dissemination on a global scale. Therefore, we invite visitors here to take up different roles, but also to learn about the mechanisms and techniques related to disinformation. In the picture, we see a game where you can take up the role as a fact checker via this fake invaders game. Confronted with lots of information from various sources, it is often difficult to determine what is true and whether a source is reliable. You will see that in today's world, it is actually vital to be able to discern where information is coming from. It is vital in today's world to be able to discern where information is coming from, and are we being informed, misinformed, or even being manipulated. And these lines are sometimes blurred. How are facts, different techniques, and emotions sometimes blended. As fact checker in the game, your goal here is to check on facts, on accuracy, but also do this as quickly as possible. Of course, if you don't want to be a fact checker, we also have a different game where you actually become a troll, and you become part of a troll farm and actually do the opposite as a fact checker. Also, part of the temporary exhibition is, I think, the known phenomenon of the filter bubble and the mechanisms of the filter bubble. But how do they actually work? And of course, probably we all know that many of the elements around the filter bubble is, of course, that it attracts that many news of media outlets are attracted into your by an algorithm in your bubble. And that by doing so, that you actually get to see the same kind of news items within the same bubble, and you're not really opposed to different kind of opinions or to different kind of news outlets. Here in the picture, we see this, how we explore this kind of phenomenon in a temporary exhibition. By moving your arms, you can attract different colors, and you create a personalized filter. And the algorithm, it will respond immediately. It will attract all the colors that you have selected first. And by doing so, your filter bubble, or in this case, your static figure, becomes one color. And it will only attract the colors that you have selected. The hollow bubbles that you can see on the picture 2, they represent the false information. Their exterior blends a bit in with the information bubbles in your personalized filter, but false information of a different color stands out. And this will actually make it that the filter bubble will blow. Initially, we also had thought to actually have 2 figures that you would be able to hug each other, but COVID, of course, had other plans with us. This playground of different games gives visitors the opportunity to explore all these mechanisms and techniques used today in a playful way. And it hopefully serves as a gentle reminder to us all to be self-critical and self-aware, what and whom to believe, what messages we share or reshare, and to explore what sources are credible and to be trusted. And of course, in this and all, to avoid that we don't fall in this in the age-old trick of the Trojan horse again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Guido. It's really great to see how actively engaged you intend your visitors to become through this, and not simply passive consumers of this exhibition, of course, but to really engage in some of these critical issues and to encourage their critical thinking. Thank you for that. We actually have had a great question from someone in our audience. Guinevere Nell asked, and so I'm going to put this to Carl now, if I may, before we move on to the next segment. Carl, if information warfare is so central, Guinevere asks, why is truth so far behind? It seems that the disinformation agents are so far ahead. Is there something you'd like to say to that question, please?
Yeah, I mean, that is a question which is absolutely core to all of the struggles which we've been going through, I think. There's, like many very important questions, there's quite a lot of different answers, and it's sometimes a bit unclear which ones become more important in which contexts. In part, one answer is to do with us, and it has to do with the way that our psychologies work, and has to do with the fact that we're not actually rational actors, and we're far more likely to subject certain kinds of claim to critical scrutiny over others. Partly it's just the basic logic of online worlds, where it's just easier and more frictionless to tell a lie than it is to rebut and undermine and investigate and, you know, eventually kind of conclusively prove that to be a lie. And by that point, other lies have been pumped out, and it's just simply ongoing. In part, it's got to do with the fact, I think, also that you know, like, because truth or lies have become irrelevant, quite often the techniques, like, the people that are doing this, like, don't even really read the content that they deploy. You know, that's what I really mean. I often don't think that they're deliberately lying to you. I often think that the lies and truths have simply become something which is a kind of quite a distant concern. So to give you another, like, let me just give you a concrete example of this. We'll go back to attention. So capturing attention is a form of territory, building territory is a strategic imperative. One of the ways that you build like attention is through growing groups. You seed groups, and you want to grow groups, and you want people to be clicking on content, and you want that to look really popular across social media. There are forums and marketplaces where you can buy viral, clickable content in bulk. You buy hundreds of thousands of packets of this information, you know, and then you just pump that out through your groups. Like, you're not reading it. Like, it's completely irrelevant to you. You know, bay leaves cure cancer. Messi's broken his leg. Pope backs Trump. You know, it doesn't matter. Like, what matters is that empirically that stuff gets clicked on. And that has the kind of effects that you want. And then lastly, I would say offense is trumping defense. So there are lots of benefits to doing this, we think. Sometimes there probably are, sometimes there aren't, but it's very cheap and easy to do. I mean, for states, this is technically extremely trivial. And there's basically no risks. You you know, I mean, apart from like public expose and potentially some embarrassment, you know, we haven't built any of the deterrent structures, the laws, you know, or anything else to really make the kind of any of this cost anything to the people that do it. I mean, like, you know, being removed from a platform because you've broken their terms of service is an occupational hazard, and that's almost always as far as any of this will ever go. So Trump is beating defense, and we haven't got anything in the West, in liberal democracies. We don't have anything like an idea of what our rules of engagement are here. Like, how do we, if information warfare is existing, how do we engage, and under what premises, and how, most importantly of all, do we do peacekeeping? How do we de-escalate? How do we demilitarize information spaces? We've got no idea about any of that. Like, do we need like a disarmament process similar to what we did with nuclear weapons? Do we all have to like hand back an information weapon one at a time, as long as we can see the counterparty doing that as well? I've got no idea. But at the moment, you know, the offensive methodologies continue to become more sophisticated and develop, and everything else is just sitting still. Apart from, I would say, the brilliant work of civil society, like, and fact checkers and journalists. Like, they're the one group that have risen up to the challenge yet. But governments, liberal democratic militaries, like, there's been almost nothing happening there.
Thank you. I'd like us to pick up on some of these questions later on in our discussions as well. So thank you for that. I'd like to move now to Mariana Spring, who is a specialist disinformation and social media reporter at BBC News. Mariana provides in-depth reports across a range of media, breaking original stories, conducting in-depth investigations. Her focus is on reporting and investigating on the human impact and the real-world consequences of viral falsehoods and conspiracies. One of the things I'd like Mariana to address in her segment, if I may, is also this issue of how the terms fake news and disinformation have somehow become conflated. I think we're quite clear on what we mean by disinformation now. Fake news, though, often seems to have been a weaponized term, which is used against established organizations that have a very deep commitment to truth-telling and a structure and an ethics in place and real-world consequences that Carl's speaking about. If they do make a mistake, they will publish the fact that they've made that mistake, and they'll correct it. I'm thinking of organizations such as your own, Mariana, BBC News, who sometimes you're called fake news, and I just would be interested in how we understand this kind of erosion of trust in those institutions and those sources of news and sources of information that traditionally have been held in very high esteem and regard. So what's going on there, perhaps, and what's that like to be in a situation where you're part of an organization which is accused of these things? So that's part of what I'd like you to speak to, please, but hand it over to you also. I'm really keen to hear more of what you feel from your research, what motivates people to initiate, share, and spread disinformation. Mariana, please.
Thanks very much, Paul, and thank you so much, Carl and Guido, for those great presentations, and all really interesting, and for having me. I will endeavour to answer those questions. I have a presentation which I will just share with you, which hopefully will work so that I can see it. Yes, so as Paul explained, I am the BBC's specialist disinformation and social media reporter, and that means I've spent most of the past year investigating the impact that online conspiracy theories and disinformation are having in the real world. And I think that the point Carl makes about how what's being shared online is weaponized by a variety of bad actors is very important. And part of my job is investigating the harm that's caused by that weaponization, if that's a word, and also who's weaponizing it and why. And I work with a great team at the BBC fact checkers at BBC Reality Check, disinformation experts at BBC Monitoring who look at how particular pieces of information spread across the internet, and journalists at BBC Trending who look into the often darker side of the internet and the online movement, which I'm sure a lot of people might have heard of, from QAnon, the baseless conspiracy that Donald Trump is waging a secret war against satanic paedophiles, to other kinds of extremist online movements. But I think that central to what you're asking me, Paul, is this issue of trust and this question of trust. And I recently wrote for a newspaper here in the UK about a year of doing my job and what that's meant. And a lot of that article included anecdotes about my time speaking to people who've been impacted by viral disinformation and also people who go on to spread it. And something that stood out to me and always stands out to me when I speak to people who have been taken in by really harmful falsehoods being spread online is how distrustful they are of everything and everyone. I was covering a protest in Brighton, I think that's where you are, Paul, back in December of last year, and I was speaking to some of the people there. It was an anti-lockdown protest, but a lot of people there were promoting anti-vaccine conspiracy theories, and I was speaking to a couple who were doing just that. They said that the vaccine is part of a global plot to try and kill everybody, and Bill Gates, the Microsoft founder, is behind it. And I started to question them, and I said, I just don't understand how that would work. Why would someone want to do that? I just really don't get it. And this man just looked at me and said, you seem to think that most people in the world are good, and I think that almost everyone in the world is bad. And as a journalist, I spend a lot of my time, and as do all good journalists, holding accountable governments, people doing bad things across all kinds of different disciplines and beats. But it really struck me that we often, when we talk about disinformation, speak about how people are gullible or have fallen victim to, as though they're stupid or crazy or silly, when actually it's often the most cynical people who are very, very distrustful, often for legitimate reasons, of authorities and others, who are the most susceptible to this stuff online. And the committed minority of activists who deploy this disinformation actively exploit that. It's very, very effective, and that's why we often find that bad information is better at spreading than good information. I think when it comes to the terms fake news and disinformation, fake news has absolutely been weaponized in a bid to undermine trusted news authorities, and has become, in a way, part of this disinformation war that's raging at the moment online and very much offline. One worry for me, particularly because it's included in my title, is that disinformation as a term is also being weaponized. It's now frequently used by governments across the world to take aim at other governments, to take aim at other types of reporting. Most recently, the BBC has been hit with accusations of disinformation by the Chinese government for its reporting and investigations into the treatment of Uyghur Muslims in the country. So it's definitely a very important conversation to have. And I spend a lot of time trying to explain what my job is, because people will accuse me of being a fake news, disinformation, PSYOP agent. Rather, it's not that at all. I investigate harmful conspiracies being shared online. And one thing I found very effective in doing that is putting a human face to these stories and understanding how this affects real people in the real world. And I think in some ways that marks the evolution of this disinformation war, particularly in the past year, that we've seen people whose lives have been destroyed, relationships ruined, violence inspired, as we saw at Capitol Hill in January, by what's being shared online. And it's that very, very acute spilling over of these conspiracies and extreme beliefs and disinformation being shared online into the real world that I think means that people like me and Carl and Clara have been very, very busy. The first story here was an interview I did with the son of someone who's grown a huge following on social media here in the UK, especially by promoting falsehoods about the pandemic, suggesting it's not real, suggesting that the vaccine is a weapon of mass destruction and similar claims to that. And he reached out to me, his name's Sebastian, because he was so worried about the impact that this was having on his relationship with his mum, and that it had effectively destroyed that relationship. And his story is in many ways emblematic of a lot that I hear all the time. People emailing me, texting me, sending me messages on Twitter about how their relationships and their families have really broken down as a consequence of radicalization by online conspiracy theories. And I think that's definitely one of the key features of the harm caused by disinformation in the past year, and one that we should remember, because we often think about the wider public implications, but a lot of this is deeply personal and is really affecting families across the UK and no doubt across Europe and the world. At the bottom there pictured is Brian. I interviewed Brian in the summer of last year. He believed that COVID was a hoax, that it wasn't real, that it could have been caused by 5G. And as a consequence, he and his wife chose not to follow health guidance, not to seek help when they both fell ill, and ended up in intensive care in the US. And very, very sadly, Erin went on to lose her life as a consequence of having spent 3 months in the ICU and having a heart attack. So for me, their story became a very worrying and shocking example of just how much harm online disinformation can cause. Most recently, I've spent a lot of time investigating the rise of anti-vaccine conspiracy theories on social media. I investigated their impact in France the week just gone. But before that, I was looking at their impact in the UK and the US for the BBC's investigative programme Panorama. And this story at the bottom is all about a woman whose foot was used online to fuel harmful vaccine conspiracy theories. She had posted on a GoFundMe page that she had these big swellings on her feet, and she also happened to have taken part in a Pfizer vaccine trial a few weeks before these big swellings appeared. She suggested and she mentioned that she'd taken part in this trial. And I think what her story shows is just how quickly an innocent mistake jumping to a conclusion can be weaponized online. She was distraught that this was being used to encourage people not to get the vaccine. And I had to investigate to figure out what was actually going on. It turns out she'd received the placebo, which was confirmed by both her doctors and the trial, and actually that the sores were unrelated to any involvement in this vaccine trial. But once it was there online, it was totally out of control. And I think when we talk about how bad information spreads much more quickly than good information, thinking about how emotive that information is crucial. I haven't included a picture of Patricia's feet here, but they were very, very swollen, very sore. And you immediately reacted to them and thought, oh my gosh, this is awful. I wouldn't want that to happen to me. And I think that's part of why her story was so effectively appropriated by a small minority of committed activists online. I investigated tactics more for BBC Panorama, and one thing that I found was that brandishing medical credentials and then going on to promote conspiracy theories is one of the most effective techniques currently being used by anti-vaccine activists and conspiracy influencers online at the moment. And I had people from across the UK getting in touch with me because they were scared off the jab by these tactics. And I think that these tactics are increasingly sophisticated. We find that there are videos where people will mix true claims with false conspiracies or stuff that's actually quite hard to fact check and debunk. And I think that poses a big problem, not just for journalists, but for the social media sites and moderators who are looking at this content. Another thing I think is crucial, particularly when we talk about trust, is actually taking people with us. When I investigate the spread of a misleading post, I like to try and show the anatomy of where it's come from and who's passed it on so that people can better understand why people spread stuff like this. And I think that transparency is crucial in increasing trust in media outlets like the BBC, who I work for. One story that I worked on at the beginning of the pandemic was about how bad information goes viral. I'm sure people might have been sent those WhatsApp messages telling you to do certain things to protect yourself against coronavirus, or holding your breath to see whether you had COVID. And the problem was a lot of this advice actually proved quite harmful. It would lead people to misdiagnose themselves or think that they didn't have COVID when they did. And so I tracked back one particular post with one of my colleagues, Olga, and we saw how it went really viral because a man in his 80s in the UK had posted it just because he likes getting likes, effectively. It was then shared by various influencers who then go on to promote products and other things that they'd like to sell. And I think that gives us a little bit of insight into the different reasons that people spread conspiracy theories, whether it's for influence online, whether it's for money, whether it's for some kind of political gain. And that leads me on to the next story, which I investigated the anatomy of. This was the Stop the Steal movement that sprung up very quickly in the days after, sprung up online in the days after the US election. These big Facebook groups full of disinformation about voting, suggesting allegations of electoral fraud, which were totally unsubstantiated, fake videos about burning ballots and everything else. And I tracked back where this had come from, how much this had been mentioned by Donald Trump on his Twitter feed, claims of voter fraud or fraudulent mail-in voting. And even further back than that, that term was actually coined back at the time of the 2016 election. So I think trying to understand how this stuff spreads does give us some insight into how these ecosystems work. And it's not just about the kind of more outlandish conspiracy theories, whether that's QAnon or coronavirus. We also see how disinformation is being weaponized online in order to abuse people, and is part of this ecosystem of trolling, conspiracies and online abuse, which can cause really serious harm. Both of the people featured here were subject to that kind of abuse. Momo, who's at the bottom, was a peaceful protester who went along to an anti-racism rally in the UK and was targeted with false accusations that he tried to set fire to a flag. He hadn't done that. Whoever was making this up had mixed him up with the person who is featured in the video, and this went very viral in far-right Facebook groups. He received death threats. It was really, really frightening, and you begin to understand how disinformation is used by extremist groups in order to target those who they want to target and who they don't like. Similarly, Gina Miller, who was a vocal campaigner for Remain during the Brexit referendum, was targeted with horrible abuse online, racist abuse, and really disgusting threats. And I actually introduced her to a person who had trolled her, which she agreed to do, and they ended up forming this very touching bond, and he was very apologetic for the harm that he'd caused. And I think what that taught me a lot about is how real life interaction, face-to-face conversations, and a bit of time trying to understand what someone thinks are crucial in weakening these online trolling systems. The problem is that how disinhibited someone can feel when using social media is very hard to overcome just by saying, oh yeah, no, come and meet me, it will be completely fine. And I think that poses a big problem for society going forwards. And I myself become very much a part of this ecosystem by reporting on online disinformation and the consequences that it has. I receive death threats. I have to have various interventions with regards to my personal safety, my online safety. And I think that that's crucial, Paul, and coming back to what you'd asked about what it's like working for a news organization that is called fake news all the time. I mean, if I would be incredibly rich if I had £1 for every time I am called fake news every day, every week, every month. And I think this says a lot, not just about the tactics of people who want to, and this isn't to say that the media doesn't make mistakes or doesn't play a role in this disinformation ecosystem, but the kinds of abuse I receive is deliberately targeted and part of an attempt to stop me doing my job, to stop me investigating the kind of ecosystems that I do and the impact it has and the bad actors involved in that. And it will not deter me from doing a job which I love and I think is very important. But I think it's really crucial that we highlight the perils faced by reporters, researchers covering this area, which are compared to, pale in comparison compared to those who are persecuted for doing their jobs as journalists throughout the world, including some of my colleagues at the BBC, but nonetheless are definitely part of this conversation when we talk about fake news or disinformation and how we cover it and the solutions. And that's all from me. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Mariana. It's fascinating, extremely powerful, and also thank you for sharing those personal experiences as well, as difficult as that must be. I think we're all aware, or I hope we are, of the increasing threats and dangers that journalists around the world are facing right now, and there have been, of course, some strong campaigns. I'm thinking Guardian has a regular feature around just this. I'm sure other news organizations do also. There was a question from someone in our audience, Mariana, specifically to you on some of these issues. Loic Verstrapen asked Mariana, what are your thoughts on Rupert Murdoch projecting to bring Fox News-style broadcast journalism to the UK, which could be described as heavily biased and polarizing? And I'd just like to add to that, if I may, it's sort of connected. You know, we see these news outlets and broadcast journalism, such as Fox, which will speak to people in a particular filter bubble, right? And we can perhaps expand on that in our conversations more widely as well. I'm also interested, though, in an organisation such as the BBC and other journalistic organisations that are very committed to a kind of balanced approach on any particular issue. Is there also, how do you decide who to invite and how many different voices to hear on a particular subject? And how much credence or how much weight is it right to give? Let's take something like climate change and climate denial. You know, if the issue is around climate change, is it right to bring in someone who denies, despite the overwhelming scientific evidence that climate change is real and it's happening? How do you manage to balance that? And if you choose not to invite someone like that, how do you avoid the accusation that, again, of bias or of some kind of political agenda there?
Thanks for that, Paul, and for the question from the audience as well. I'll try and answer the best I can within my pay grade. But yeah, I think when it comes to the UK media landscape and the changes that are happening there, one thing I found, particularly from reporting on the impact of conspiracy theories being shared online in the US, is how much the media environment in the States plays a role and is a part of that ecosystem. I think we have a slightly different landscape here in the UK, but I can understand the concerns of those who fear that the introduction of new types of broadcasters or radio could further contribute to a very polarized sphere, especially online. And I think that's something that plays a massive role when it comes to online conspiracies and disinformation more generally, particularly because a lot of people can see that they personally will benefit if they have very polarizing views and can grow big online followings. And that's certainly the case when it comes to those who promote conspiracy theories about the pandemic, about the vaccine, or even QAnon. You can build a very committed following and you can draw a lot of attention to yourself by doing that. I think when it comes to the BBC's own coverage, I know that something that I really love about doing my job is that, and perhaps it's something that has changed over the past decade, is that when it comes to something being true or false, there is no need for balance. It is either true or it is false. And so I think when you talk about climate change, that's something I know that the BBC are now acutely aware of, not platforming people who promote things that are untrue. When it comes to my job, there are a lot of editorial considerations we have about which stories we cover and what we investigate. And the issue of amplification is a huge one, because what you don't want to do is promote promote disinformation or a particular individual who is spreading disinformation to a much wider audience and to legitimize what they are doing. And it's for that reason that I spend a lot of my time focusing on the people who are impacted, the victims of these conspiracy theories, because they reveal to you the harm that is caused, but they also are very much worthy subjects for interview and for investigations. And at the same time, I do interview and challenge those who deliberately spread disinformation and seek to expose that kind of malicious behavior. But we have to do that very carefully, often in longer, more nuanced reports that's possible, like the Panorama investigation I did, as opposed to something that's simply going online. And I think that's one thing that's brilliant at working at the BBC, because you can do long form investigative reporting at the same time as news reporting across broadcasts and more generally. So I think that there are all kinds of very interesting discussions we have in our team meetings, which I think people would find fascinating, about what to cover and when to cover it, and why it's important to cover it. And I think that speaks to your question about how the BBC makes decisions about this, and what they do. But I definitely think that the fact that I exist is testament to the approach of the BBC, that if something is false or untrue, it shouldn't be given the same amount of credence as things that are true.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So we'll move now to our final panelist. Delighted to welcome Clara Jimenez Cruz, who is the co-founder and head of Maldita, a Spanish non-profit news organization, which is focused on stopping disinformation through fact-checking and through data journalism. Maldita develops tech tools that enable citizens to make informed decisions and engages with its audience in innovative formats. And I hope, Clara, that you'll be able to enable and empower us all to play a much more active role in countering disinformation. Please, Clara.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, everyone, for being here and for listening. I'm going to try. I'm not sure I'm going to make it, but I'm going to try as much as I can. Let me share my screen. There you go. So Paul introduced it, but Maldita is basically a non-profit fact-checking organization that has been going on for 4 years now. And what we do is fight disinformation in public and political spectrum. I brought some data and some research that I think it's kind of important to understand where we are when we talk about misinformation. So the last disinformation Eurobarometer that was undertaken, it's 2018, it's not very up to date, but it gives us some kind of impression of where the European population feels disinformation is and how much it affects them. For example, how often do you come across news or information that you believe misrepresent reality or might even be false? And over 38% of the population, over 30% of the population say every day, and over 31% say once a week, which is very high if we take into account that we're talking about the European Union and about a bunch of countries that actually have higher levels of media literacy than others around the world. When we ask the population how confident or not are you that you're able to identify news or information that misrepresent reality, only 15% are very confident and 56% are somewhat confident. And if you see how many people say that they find or they come across disinformation on a daily basis or on a weekly basis, you understand that they're actually being able to see that that is disinformation, which I think is good news, even if we tend to look at these numbers from the other perspective. And the last one, and I think this is extremely important and goes to a question that Paul asked me before this panel. In your opinion, is the existence of news or information that misrepresent reality or even false a problem? And over 80%, 85%, yes, that it is. It's dangerous for democracies in our countries and for the European Union in general. And this goes to the question that Paul asked me, which was, do people really, really want to fight disinformation? Are they just consuming it because they like it? And I've been going through our research database today to gather some assumptions that I think are important to understand that disinformation is a problem, that it affects us all, and that we can fight against as citizens. We tend to think disinformation affects others more than us. And this is many of the people that are speaking here today, and probably many of the people that are listening, we all tend to say disinformation affects the people that have less media literacy, that aren't dedicated to news on a daily basis, and that's true, but the people we refer to also think that disinformation affects to others. That's what research tells us. In a crisis, the void left by official verified information is filled with disinformation that is taken as valuable. And this is a feeling that I'm sure many of us have had throughout the pandemic, that basically because there was no information out there, especially at the beginning, because we didn't know what we were dealing with, we took any piece of information we found as valuable because we were scared. And being scared in crisis is basically being a human being. It's not so weird, but we need to take that into account when we confront crises, and also when we run programs, organizations, institutions. Fact-checking works even if it goes against our ideology or beliefs, and this is something that most people think, that fact-checking doesn't work. It will not convince someone that is totally on the other ideological side of the spectrum. Actually, what research shows is that it does. There's not so much research around Europe on this topic, but in the US, there's a lot of research of how fact-checking affects Republican and Democrat voters, even if it goes against their beliefs. And it's important to take this into account, because many times we dismiss fact-checking because we think it's not going to be able to fight against polarizations in countries. But what research shows, again, is that it does. And we need to have consumed the piece of disinformation in order for the fact check to be effective. So proactive fact checking, if you have not consumed that disinformation, doesn't work and can contribute to amplification. But if you have come across that piece of misinformation, it can help you. So gathering all this and taking all this into account, I'm going to give a series of recommendations on the way I think we should fight disinformation right now, but also moving towards the future. And many of you are probably aware that the Digital Service Act is being debated right now in the European Parliament and in the European Commission. And these are going to be topics that we're going to be talking about a lot in the following 2 years. So I think it's good to have some more information at hand. One of the things we need to start doing is to stop elite thinking. And when I say elite thinking, I'm referring basically to this, the conversations that many of us are probably having on Twitter on a daily basis, because we have liberal professions, we're journalists, and we tend to talk about politics and news and have very informed opinions on some specific topics. Otherwise, the world looks something like this. There's an upper level of the conversation where journalists, politicians, and informed citizens are, and there's the rest of the conversation. And the rest of the conversation is actually the one that fact checkers should be addressing, because that's where misinformation is going through. The problem that we've encountered throughout the past years, and that we see also on other media outlets, is that journalists tend to really like to talk on the upper conversation and about the upper conversation topics. So randomly will they go down to the lower conversation and listen to what are the needs of the people that are believing the conspiracy theories that Marianne was talking about, or the people that are sharing misinformation around political context. There are many people from the UK on this panel now, and it has come up quite a couple of times. If you see the demographics of people that voted to go on the Brexit, you sort of start understanding this kind of thing. I'm going to show you an example for Spain. A mosquito that can leave you pregnant with just one bite is probably a story that not many of us within this conversation would take for real at any time. But this is one of the topics that people have asked recurrently about to Maldita, because they were believing it was true, even if it's a satirical magazine. In order to actually fight disinformation, we need to address these topics, even if we as journalists think they're not important. We're not going to win a Pulitzer for debunking this, but we're going to give people information that they actually need. This is an extreme example, but we come across a lot of disinformation that we debunk on a daily basis that we would probably not have chosen as the topic we would want to write about, but those are the questions that we're being asked. And it's important to answer them, because once you start answering the questions that people have, they will start asking more questions that will take them to the upper level of the conversation, which is where we would actually want them to be. The second thing we need to take into account when we're thinking about disinformation is that it varies from region to region, and it depends on each region. Where are you supposed to be listening to those questions and to the people that you actually need to serve as a fact checker, or as an institution, or as a media literacy advocacy? Take it from your perspective. In Spain, we tend to say a lot that there are all these AI machines that are going through Twitter to see which is the next hot piece of misinformation. No one uses Twitter in Spain, really, no one. most people use WhatsApp. And what we discovered is that most people are actually working or consuming disinformation on WhatsApp, because the Reuters Institute Digital News report says that 34% of the population consume news through WhatsApp in Spain. And this is a very high number compared to the rest of the European countries. So people are mostly consuming disinformation also on WhatsApp. That's why we developed a WhatsApp chatbot that can actually receive any inputs from our community, asking us questions and answer them automatically. That's where we develop those kinds of technical tools that can enable us to fulfill our missions in an easier way, because in the end, Maldita is a very small organization. The second thing we need to start thinking about is that most of the fact-checking efforts and journalistic efforts around the fight of disinformation, and even of the institutional efforts, tend to look at disinformation again from the upper level, and we usually address those factors and those debunks from the perspective of, let's write an article, like a 1,000-word article. Let's do a segment on a TV show at 10 p.m. What we've discovered that works better is to actually copy what the bad guys use as formats, topics, and tones. We've decided to change the way we do journalism to make it sexier in a way that people that don't usually consume news will come and consume the fact checks that are the ones that are shaping their reality. So we basically started doing formats like this, in which we got a hoax and we debunked it in a way that it looked actually like a hoax, but it got much more impact than the initial hoax afterwards. Or this, we do a lot of images, comics, videos. That's me doing a silly video, probably, but it works. And we get to the people that we actually need to get talking to. And then for the people that are here listening to this and thinking, I'm not a journalist, I don't work in any European institution, this has nothing to do with me. Okay, so we are part of the problem as citizens, every one and each of us, and we are also part of the solution. We need to get involved. In which ways? Whenever we receive something, we need to stop, we need to think, and we need to check that whatever we are consuming is actually true or false. Most of the time, it only takes like 10 seconds to question it and to realize that maybe that thing that you really want to send your cousin-in-law or your brother-in-law is not true, or is not reliable, at least. If it's not reliable, don't send it. And the other thing we need to start doing much more, and I think Marianne talked about some of the ways in which we want to do this, especially with people that are extremely biased and have gone all through the rabbit hole of conspiracy theories, is that we need to correct our friends' mistakes. Don't get me wrong, you don't have to be rude. You don't have to go on the WhatsApp group or on the Facebook group and humiliate the person. But if you take them apart and tell them, hey, this thing that you shared the other day is not true for this reason, and this reason, believe me that in the end, they will end up saying thank you, because no one likes to be lied at. Again, research shows that when you correct those kinds of things, people are actually grateful and they change the view they have on that specific topic. Maybe not on the whole problem, but bit by bit, that changes the perception someone might have, even if they're on a crazy conspiracy theory. And last but not least, the cooperation among stakeholders is key. This is not something that the European institutions are gonna do only by legislation. This is not something that fact checkers are gonna solve all by themselves. This is not something that platforms can solve all by themselves. We all need to work together and bring together the different pieces of the puzzle to actually find a solution to this problem. And I'm not sure enough that we will be able to solve it, but I'm sure that we can make it a bit less harmful than it is right now. And I'm talking about, I can set examples. Maldita works with all the tech platforms, but also with the European institutions and the Spanish institutions, and with researchers and with schools and media literacy projects, so that on each side, we can put a small piece of sand that can help solve the problem in a broader way. And that's all from me. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Clara. It's inspiring and so good to have something which is a little hopeful here in an otherwise perhaps rather pessimistic picture that perhaps we all share from time to time. On that issue of optimism and pessimism, if we go back to the early days of the internet and its seeming promise to help democratize societies, this idealistic notion that we would all have free access to all the best information in the world, that the world has to offer, that we would know the world better. And not only that, that we would also be able to hear unheard voices. There would be more participation, more activity from our citizens, more engagement. That seemed to be the promise. How pessimistic are you all today in the way that the internet has played out, social media, other fora? I'll start, if you like, from my perspective. It certainly hasn't turned out like that. It seems that if anything, if we can't even agree on what is true, and if we can't hear each other without polarizing into these more extremist camps, there's a genuine threat to democracy. And it feels to me that our democratic systems are rather fragile right now, this being one element of it. So I'm just interested in how pessimistic you are, how optimistic, what can be done. Do you think, is it still possible to capture the early promise of these kinds of technologies? I don't know who'd like to start with that. Mariana, perhaps?
Sure.
Well, sorry, Carl, you go, please.
I mean, just very quickly, Paul, like, we have all that too. I mean, let's not forget, like, the access to the most amazing repositories of human knowledge ever created, available to everyone for free, is also right at our fingertips. Over the last 20 years, we also created Wikipedia. Like, it's the first digital wonder of the world. And let's not understate the kind of tremendous kind of avalanche of information that the internet has let loose on people all over the world that otherwise wouldn't have access to barely any information at all. The problem is that right now we've got both amazing facts and absolutely terrible facts, kind of both in greater quantity than we ever have before. And a lot of those kinds of social institutions that we've created, including journalism, that has always kind of helped us navigate through waters like that, have in many ways themselves been weakened over that time at exactly the same moment, swept away in some cases by seas of user-generated content. And I think if there's one thing that human beings do time and time again, is we rebuild the norms and social institutions and mores and professional standards and all the kind of squishy human moralistic things to suit the new age we find ourselves in. We did it during the Industrial Revolution, we did it during the Enlightenment, we did it during the Renaissance. And I do, the kind of pessimism, at least that you hear coming from me, is really because I'm kind of feeling we're in this, quite vulnerable kind of interstitial moment where the way that society works has I think we all agree, changed extremely profoundly, but those institutions haven't really yet been remolded to suit the new realities we find ourselves in. So I don't really see us on this kind of perpetual unavoidable decline in any way. But I do think there is this quite important disjunction now between the way in which information flows around society and the ways in which beliefs are formed, and that whole kind of messy complex of norms and settlements that we create to try and guide our way through all that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would very much kind of agree with what Carl said, and I think that it's very true that there are lots of positive things about the internet and about social media that we all benefit hugely from. The problem is that they come with these huge downsides, and I think that one thing I always find very uplifting, and Clara spoke very well about it, is how you yourself can tackle disinformation in your own life that you're seeing online, whether it's spotting it, whether it's telling your friends who are sharing it, oh, I don't think this is true, here, let me help, or by engaging with people in your life who might have fallen down the conspiracy rabbit hole and trying to help them out of it. And one thing I try and do with all my reporting is investigate and report from a point of empathy to try and understand how these ecosystems work, why people are falling victim to them, as well as holding accountable those biggest structures, whether it's social media companies or governments themselves. And I think in some ways it does feel as though there's sort of light at the end of the tunnel, or you hope that there might be. And every person I interview who's been negatively impacted by online disinformation, it is heartbreaking. But at the same time, for instance, this lovely woman in her 80s called Rosemary, who I interviewed for the Panorama investigation I did, she WhatsApps me all the time now, and she tells me about how she's on the lookout for fake news on social media and all she's learned about spotting stuff. Her and her husband are in their 80s and they're getting really involved in this. So I think that while it's definitely a big problem and one that's not quickly or easily resolved in any way, and as a reporter as opposed to a campaigner, it's not my job to resolve it, but I think by doing that reporting and by doing that investigating and highlighting the harm and what we can all do and the structural problems, we perhaps can get to a point where it looks much more positive than it does at the moment.
Thank you. Clara, did you want to add something to this?
Yeah, I basically agree with both of you. I think there are two things that are very important that we take into account, especially in the following months with the discussions we're going to have about how to regulate platforms, etc. One is that the internet and the platforms we know that have spread so much disinformation have democratized disinformation, but also information. We are able to read 70 papers around the world every day because of the internet we know right now. And that goes to my second point, which is that this topic is extremely delicate and extremely complex, and it goes through so many stakeholders that we need to be very careful on which way we decide to regulate it, because otherwise we can end up with an internet that looks nothing like what we know right now, that looks nothing like what we cherish from this internet, which is freedom of speech, anonymity, things that are bad for disinformation or good to spread it, but they're also what makes the internet so magical. So we really need to have these conversations on, I think, on bigger levels. My biggest concern right now is that all these conversations around the regulation of social media and platforms and the internet are not happening amongst the citizens of the different European countries. And that's critical, because if this ends up being up to 750 MPs in Brussels, I don't like the outcome of it.
Thank you, Clara. You're speaking there also to a question we had from Annie Eric, who asked, should the spread of fake news be regulated? If so, how? And what is the threat there to limiting free speech and democracy? So I think you've absolutely touched on those questions that Annie was asking. I don't know if Carl and Mariana, you want to add to that particular point as well about regulation. What kind of regulation would be appropriate?
Yeah, I mean, I've spent quite a lot of time, particularly and this is very UK focused, but interviewing and speaking to politicians and ministers about different bills and regulations being proposed here in the UK. So the online harms bill, which is a bit of legislation that's been delayed a lot, and many critics are very worried that as a consequence, people have come to harm as a result of online disinformation, because that legislation would enforce a duty of care on the social media sites to their users in a way that they don't necessarily have to do right now. And I think there are big questions and challenges about how social media sites are or aren't regulated and what that means. And this issue of freedom of speech versus online disinformation is a difficult one. And I think depending where you are in the world, different people have different reactions to it. I find here in the UK that a lot of people I speak to, and a lot of polling supports this, are opposed to online conspiracies and disinformation that cause real world harm, that cause direct harm, that lead someone to hurt themselves or kind of very serious real world consequences, as opposed to freedom of speech. Whereas if you look over at the United States, that makeup is different. People have different views on that. And when I was reporting recently on the impact of anti-vaccine conspiracies in France, again, there was a kind of overwhelming emphasis on freedom of speech versus possible harm caused. So I don't think that this is an easily resolved debate or conversation, and it's one that is clearly going on across the world in different places in different ways. And it will be interesting to see how it plays out, particularly because I think this topic and this problem is becoming, especially since the riots at Capitol Hill, but also because of the pandemic, one that's very high up the agenda for a lot of people in governments or in social media sites.
So thank you, Mariana. Carl, just I know we're close to running out of time, and I want to thank all three of you so much for sharing your thoughts, your insights, and your expertise. I've learned a huge amount from all of you. I'm sure our participants, our audience, have done too. And thank you to everyone in the audience who's given your comments and your questions. I apologise there hasn't been time for all of them. There's been a lot coming in thick and fast. Carl, just on that issue of around regulation, or you spoke to quite rightly the incredibly positive aspect of the internet, which has provided so much free information. On the other hand, how free is that information? There is a cost, right? And people do pay for it, and a lot of information is monetized, and the kinds of advertising revenue that gets generated by certain sites, if they have more followers or if they're attracting more traffic, that seems to, certain algorithms seem to kind of feed this. I wonder from your work in terms of research into the digital world, if there's anything you could speak to about that, and is there a future for us with the internet, which perhaps part of the problem is a kind of capitalist model which is fueling this. I wonder how much you agree or disagree with that idea, and what might be done about it.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, I've got a series of multi-layered and strongly held opinions when it comes to digital regulation, which I don't unfortunately have time to reflect upon you all. But I will light on just a few. So look, one of my main points was that at least when we look at organized actors doing this, like explicitly lying is only one of an array of techniques which are being used. And another being simply making some truths more visible than another is equally potent. In many circumstances. Now, could we regulate to constantly intervene, to constantly remove a series of messages which platforms would host or propagate? I can't really see a reality where that is the case. I would much rather that states go after the kind of concerted and organized versions of this happening. Which actually often involve reaching beyond platforms, not forcing the platforms to do more. We have to increase the costs and risks of this being done. And Facebook and Twitter and the other platforms are private companies that, however smart and large they are, can actually levy very, very small penalties on an intelligence operation being run from Russia, for instance, or China. Like, we've got to actually deploy, and it sounds strange for a liberal think tank to say this, we've actually got to deploy more of our national security architecture and treaty architecture and NATO to start like interacting in this space more. But then lastly, the other main point I was making was that underneath the content itself, there's many other kinds of lie which are constantly being told. You know, the manufacturing of massive audiences, the idea of trending, social reputation systems, and the curation of the platforms as well. These are all being gamed, it's probably there that I would want to see regulation like rummaging a lot more around in. you know, and to finish on the point that you specifically asked me about, yes, all platforms are optimized for engagement. They're all designed to keep you on the platform as long as possible, and we've got to find a better principle to organize our information systems around, and that's not going to come out of the private sector itself. Like, that's going to have to be a intervention which is done for reasons other than growth and other than market share. And I don't see where that comes from apart from a state.
Carl, Clara and Mariana and Guido, thank you all again so much for your contributions. I think it's been a fascinating conversation. I'm in mind of a leading politician in my country, Michael Gove, during the Brexit debate, saying people in this country have had enough of experts. That's, I think, rather dismaying kind of idea, but I don't think anyone who's joined us today would agree with that. I think your expertise, your insights, your knowledge, your experience has been invaluable to all of us. And to answer one of the questions that we did have from the audience, who was asking about, where do I draw the line as a skeptic? Do I need to fact check the fact checkers? Who watches the watchers? I think we can fall back on disciplinary knowledge and on ethics and professionalism. We have to put our faith somewhere. We have to make some choices about who we're going to believe. And I think not just going for the things that we want to hear, but respecting that expertise, that deep expertise which is out there, and accessing it is probably a good starting point for all of us. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us, those of you that are out there. And just to highlight that in our series of Between Truth and Trust, we have 3 of these intensive conversations and debates. The next topic is on denying crimes. I'm minded of Gregory Stanton's Stages of Genocide, where he says that the final stage of all genocides is denial. And we will investigate that concept, that manifestation, with another round of experts. It's on April the 28th, Guido, I'm looking to you. And it will be the same time, same place, this platform. I hope many of you will sign up to that. Please have a look on the website where you found this information, where you registered, and you'll be able to sign up for that too, I hope. Thank you all so much.